Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Pathfinder presented by Payload, the leading digital media company in the space industry. I'm your host Mo Islam, and today we're joined by Evan Rogers, the CEO and co-founder of True Anomaly. Founded just last year, True Anomaly has already caught the DoD's eyes with their plans to build fleets of autonomous, actively responsive satellites that can be used for military missions in space. But before we get into the episode, a quick word from our sponsors. SpiderOak's Orbit Secure software is designed for hybrid space operators struggling to manage the chaos of securing data flow and access to and from tens of thousands of small satellites in low Earth orbit. Using a unique combination of end-to-end zero-trust encryption and blockchain distributed ledger, Orbit Secure allows your mission to orchestrate and secure Earth-to-orbit, orbit-to-Earth transmission, communication, and storage of sensitive data across even the most complex and unsecure hybrid space environments. To learn how Orbit Secure can bring zero-trust security and resiliency to your zero-gravity environments, check out SpiderOak at www.spideroak.com. Evan, welcome to the show.
Mo, thanks. Great to be here.
Or should I say Jolly? That's your call sign, isn't it?
Yeah. I probably should take that off LinkedIn. Some people think people call me Jolly, they think it's my first name.
Well, I asked one of your members of your team for your email so I could send you the calendar invite for this, and the email read Jolly, and I was like, "Yeah, is that him? Did I get the wrong person?" But I did a little Googling, and I was like, "Oh, that's cool. It's his call sign." So we're obviously going to start with that story.
Okay. Oh, well, man. Unfortunately, there are rules around telling call sign stories. First of all, they can never be recorded. Oh, yeah. And you have to buy me a beer, Mo. So next time, maybe we can come to the factory, we could do that.
All right. Fair enough. Yeah. Okay. Well, you were in the Air Force, right? So maybe let's start there. We'd love to hear a little bit about your story of how you went from the military to Silicon Valley. Now, there's more of that these days, but that's certainly not something that I think that wasn't a career path that we saw a lot of 10 years ago.
Yeah, or it was a career path that a select number of veterans took that kind of came from certain operational communities, the Special Operations Community SEALs. Very few people I think are coming out of the space community or their air community and doing it. So
Exactly.
Yeah. So I'll give you my background. I was a space operations officer in the Air Force for 9 years. The community that I was a part of became the kind of the seed for the Space Force from a personnel standpoint. I started my career in 2012 out of officer training school, and I was one of the rare folks that actually wanted to go be a space operations officer. A lot of people don't pick it as their number one choice coming out of school, but I've always been a space nerd, so to speak. I've always loved it. I've always sort of dreamt about all the wonderful things that humans can do in space, and wanted to go participate as much as I could with a liberal arts education. The best way to do that was the military, or I was going to go get a PhD in anthropology or something like that. So I chose the former. My career happened to be right on top of when the space community was starting to speak a little bit more openly about the threats to space systems after effectively a 10-year hiatus that came from focusing the Department of Defense's efforts on counterinsurgency operations in the Middle East. So up until really 2001, there really was a concerted effort to think through vulnerabilities in the space domain. There was an effort that was led by Donald Rumsfeld, who was the secretary at the time, to put together a commission to say, what are the vulnerabilities that we have that basically lost its momentum as a result of 9/11. We spent 10 years in counterinsurgency operations. And then we were reminded that there's this thing that's happening in the background called global great power competition. And again, I started my career right as the community was starting to think through those things more seriously. I started my career at the organization called 4th Space Operations Squadron. We flew big billion-dollar satellites to do national security missions. So I saw the sort of legacy approach to space operations, right? Satellites that are not designed to defend themselves, that are basically just like what General Hyten called big, fat, juicy targets in space. I happened to be witness to a couple of activities by China and Russia that were kind of wake-up calls to the space community. That got me interested in how do we think about defending systems that were designed to be defended? So I went to a school called the Air Force Weapons School, which is sort of the Top Gun for space. I only use there's probably Air Force people listening to this who would say, dude, don't say that. But it's the way that everybody else understands it.
Yeah.
So I'll probably lose my call sign over that.
There's going to be a movie about you at some point.
Oh, no way. Yeah, definitely not. And hopefully not. Yeah. But Tom Cruise will probably be around to play me if there were. The dude doesn't age, right?
No, it does not age. No.
Yeah.
We'll have to hear about some of your stunts while you're serving.
There are many. So
I don't want to get you in trouble. We're not talking about that anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Those are also conversations over a beer. Yeah. So I went to the Air Force Weapons School, finished that in 2016. I went to an organization called the Space Aggressors, the 527 Space Aggressor Squadron, one of the coolest units in the Air Force. A group of operators that study the tactics of our adversaries, and then go fly systems that aren't really designed to be used as threat replication systems, but to go train blue audiences. And that means other fellow operators like myself to really get the first experience of, quote, combat operations. This really started in the air community with the air aggressors, Red Air. And the space community realized that it needed it as well. And so stood up the 527 Space Aggressor Squadron. I was the weapons officer there. And while I was there, I got the opportunity to sort of mature threat replication in space for space audiences. Up until that point, it had largely been focused on sort of what space is providing to the air and other joint fight, which we can get into if you're interested later on, sort of part of the arc of evolution of space operations. So got an opportunity to do that with one of my co-founders, Dan Brunsky. We flew a spacecraft called the Angels satellite, which is a horrible acronym, very typical of the Department of Defense military systems, to fly sort of what we believed were adversary flight profiles. After that, I was picked up to go to DARPA, and then I went to an organization called Space Security and Defense Program based in Colorado Springs, where I led a team of operators, scientists, and engineers to develop tactics and test systems in their operational environment. And then rounded out my career at Joint Task Force Space Defense in Colorado Springs also. Spent a lot of time in Colorado, where I was a joint fires officer responsible for planning space capabilities and integrating those space capabilities into the joint fight. And I keep using that term. And what that means is just military operations that involve other services, including the Space Force now. So air, space, cyber, we fight as a joint force. We don't fight as a service. And then while I was in that assignment, I just had a couple of experiences that made it very clear that the space security community, space defense community, that included the defense industrial base, was ripe for disruption, and that we needed to move faster than we were moving, and we needed to work more efficiently than we were moving and working to field the capabilities that we really need urgently to provide a credible deterrent against adversaries like Russia and China, and to secure the space domain so that we can take the next big leap as a species. So long story, but that's kind of my background. And then the initial genesis to leaping over into what you called, quote, Silicon Valley.
Yeah, no, it's an amazing story. And I want to hear, you're at a point now where you've clearly understood and you have a firm grasp over what the DoD needs, right, from a capabilities perspective, right? So you're sitting there, and I'm kind of wondering at that point, I'm sure the idea for True Anomaly was brewing. And was it something where you were like, hey, I need to be, I sort of need to be on my own with the team to be able to pull this off in the speed that I want to be able to pull it off? Or was it or what ultimately drove you to kind of take the leap and start True Anomaly? And maybe before we jump into that question, actually, why don't we give the audience a quick overview of what True Anomaly is?
Sure. Yeah. True Anomaly is a defense industrial partner for the national security space enterprise, which consists of the intelligence community, the Space Force, and others. Our vision is a secure, sustainable, and stable space environment for the benefit of the U.S. allies and partners, in response to sort of the potential consequences of a conflict extending into space. And I think we're going to talk about that later, Mo. So we'll leave that there. Yeah, the genesis really was, again, these 2-3 experiences that one of my co-founders and I had, Tom Nichols, who's our chief product officer, in which Russia or China would do something and we would get approached. We're on the ops floor in Schriever Air Force Base, and a general officer would come over to us and say, Jolly, Pumper, his call sign's Pumper, what do we have to deal with these threats? And the answer, in short, was nothing nothing for a long time, right?
Right.
And that's a slight exaggeration, but it always seemed like the need was now, and the capabilities were too far out to make a difference, and too far out to really reliably be effective when they would be fielded, right? Mm-hmm. The hallmark, one of the hallmarks of the space environment today from a security standpoint is that it's rapidly evolving. And so you really can't take the approach of making these grand technological investments that take 5 to 10 years to field and tens of billions of dollars to field. You have to iterate very quickly.
Yep.
And you have to do that without an understanding of formal requirements, or without the government articulating formal requirements, because the truth is that even those requirements are a work in progress. Our understanding of the things that we want to do in the space domain are a work in progress still today. And so if we study the problem for 3 years and then spend 5 to 10 years building a solution, well, it's almost certainly going to be obsolete, right?
Right.
So I looked around at the landscape of contractors and just realized that there wasn't an industrial partner for the Space Force that could move at speed with understanding, and field the solutions that are foundational to space security and to the way that the Space Force and intelligence community, we believe, wants to operate.
How did you pick your initial team?
They were the team of 4 co-founders, you mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All people that I trusted and who I knew brought very specific perspectives to the conversation. People that just had great judgment, right, and a great capacity for strategic thinking, and knew what we didn't know, knew what they didn't know about industry. I mean, look, veterans starting businesses is a compelling and interesting thing, but also comes with risk, because while we may have leadership skills and ability and operational practices, and running a business is analogous, but different enough that you can certainly fall into the trap where you think that, like, oh, I know how to do this, right? Because I've run teams.
I want to get into that a little bit, because the 4 of you guys have very, very interesting backgrounds, and I love sort of the complementary nature and how you're in the parts of the business that you're building. But of course, like you said, the natural like impression that you get reading all of your backgrounds is, great leaders, right? So I definitely want to think about how you guys are thinking about the commercial side of now running a business together, the 4 of you. But before we get into that, let's talk really quickly about product, right? So I know you have a mission coming up later this year. What are sort of the initial products that you are developing, that you've started to gain traction with the government, and how are you sort of thinking about that kind of product roadmap over the next couple of years?
We're really going after what we view are the big problems for the Space Force. So it starts there, right? Mm-hmm. And where we think that there isn't necessarily an incumbency that already exists. So for us, that looks like operational test and training infrastructure. That looks like responsive operations and dynamic operations. And it looks like space domain awareness. So those are the 3 focus areas from a product standpoint. The Jackal spacecraft that we've built satisfies the significant requirements that exist across all of those products. And the Jackal spacecraft, the Jackal Autonomous Orbital Vehicle, is a spacecraft that's designed to operate safely in close proximity to other satellites autonomously, to do really mostly intelligence and imaging operations, but those types of operations also apply to things like training. So you want to be able to maneuver and change other states of the vehicle to learn how to fly in the space domain, but also test other capabilities in the space domain. So those are the 3 focus areas for the business. And then that's supported by a software suite we call Mosaic, Mosaic is a command and control software and a training software that allows for the ingestion of heterogeneous data sources, filters that through sophisticated algorithms of our own design that make sense of the space environment, activities in the space domain in ways that are unique. Because again, Dan Brunsky in particular, and our CTO and my background was in tactics research. So if you think about operational problems and astrodynamics problems through the lens of sense making, delivering data to an operator, the right kind of data to an operator to be able to answer certain operational questions, then you develop displays and workflows that are very different than traditional command and control systems today. And so we want to develop a software suite that allowed operators to very quickly develop intuition about their environment and then control vehicles or heterogeneous suites of vehicles to achieve missions at sort of the level of effect rather than at the level of vehicle control. So those are sort of the two technologies and the three product verticals for True Anomaly.
Right. So as far as sort of the demo mission coming up, is that a revenue generating mission from the government? If you can speak to that, and then two, if it's just developing flight heritage, what will the Jackal be doing exactly? Is it going to be taking a image of an adversary's craft, or is it just really testing the capability by doing reconnaissance work on another type of asset?
I'm going to pass on the contractual aspects of that mission,
sure,
just for now, Mo. But
yeah,
but the objective of that, there's several objectives. We obviously have core technical objectives, but just at a high level, flight heritage is obviously really important. It's important to note that we're using well-known subsystems that are mature technologies that have a higher manufacturing readiness level, a high technology readiness level, because we don't think that the major innovations today are in hardware. It's actually at the convergence of hardware and software, that sense-making process. So it's very easy for us to just say, yep, all the hardware that's sort of available to commercial operators today, subsystems that are available, are sufficient to go deliver a first-generation capability, and then really focus on incredible software and autonomy. So it's the flight heritage and the maturity of the interface between software and hardware, the concept of operations, which means can we go fly the thing safely?
Got it.
And then can we prove out new tactics and new techniques and procedures? And the reason that we're launching 2 satellites this fall as opposed to just one, which is pretty typical of kind of a typical or very typical of most commercial operators who are testing a system for the first time, is we needed to do imaging of a target that we had control of. So we need to launch 2 satellites. We need to be able to change the state of one of the satellites selectively and in a controlled way, right? So that we could test the effects of lighting, the effects of proximity, the effects of maneuvers, right, by your target.
So two jackals that are going to be working basically and testing each other effectively, right? Different maneuvers,
that's exactly
different
right.
capabilities.
Yeah,
I see. Okay.
Yeah, and there's a natural anti-fragility to that too. So if one breaks, we can still achieve a ton of our objectives.
Right.
Yeah.
Got it. Yeah. And have you publicly announced when that mission is going to take place?
Yeah, it'll be launched on SpaceX Transporter 9. So one of these big transporter missions that 60 satellites go up on. We have 2 of the slots on it.
Great, awesome. Now, I hope it's not too much of a stretch, but I'm curious. As far as your initial customer base and your market, is it safe to say that 100% of that market is going to be governments, or do you see other types of non-state actors? And at a larger scale, how do you think about sort of the size of that market today and what it looks like over the long run?
Yeah, let me work backwards into that. So the size of the market is large and growing. The estimates, I mean, you can go to any number of sort of resources and get estimates that are in the $1 trillion range over the next 10 years. The thesis that we have about the market is that a security infrastructure has to exist in order for the commercial the growth of the commercial market to exist, right? Given sort of the state of contemporary geopolitics. So when I said that the vision of True Anomaly is a secure, stable, and sustainable space environment, what I'm really talking about is that if you look sort of through history, the lines of commerce, the lines of communication that make countries and sort of the global order successful is an underlying security apparatus and security infrastructure, right? So there has to be a minimum level of certainty that your goods aren't going to be affected as you travel from point A to point B, right? And if you look at some of the many like sort of strategic hotspots terrestrially around the world, they're in areas of very important shipping, right? The flow of commerce. So I think the same sort of phenomenon is going to emerge in the space domain. And what that looks like is a company what that looks like for True Anomaly is the technologies and the processes that scale as the commercial market scales, and even creates a market that allows for the commercial market to grow even more substantially. We're starting that process in the DoD because we believe that the technologies are going to mature, ironically, more quickly in the Department of Defense because the operational challenges are more severe in the Department of Defense, presented by the DoD today. We will very quickly expand our offering to include commercial and civil. Not ready to say anything specific about that, but we're certainly today cultivating strategic relationships that will allow us to capitalize on that when the time comes.
Yeah, got it. Great. Okay. So a metric I've heard you've referenced in the past is cost to maneuver, and would love for you to explain a little bit of like what that means, especially in the context of the Space Force and defense systems. Why is that metric so important?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite topics.
Evan, that's what I'm here for. I want to just give you some good softballs. Give you some good layups, some softballs.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. Yeah. So the metric is cost per maneuver, right? Cost comes in many forms, but we track cost per meter per second. So meter per second is your change in velocity, delta V, change of velocity required to change your orbit. So there are a couple of ways to achieve cost per meter per second. Optimal cost per meter per second. You can have really, really big systems that are relatively inexpensive, but have a ton of gas, right? A ton of delta V. Or you can have thousands and thousands of systems that have a scaled amount of gas, but that are very, very, very inexpensive, right? So you can achieve the same effect from the standpoint of that singular metric. The other thing that you have to consider is time of flight. So can I get to a place where I need to get to in a reasonable amount of time? If I have a large spacecraft that has a ton of delta V but has low impulse, then I really can't meet operational requirements because it may take me months, right? This is the problem of electric propulsion. So we explore propulsion techniques and that drive towards sort of an optimal relationship between total delta V capacity and cost per meter per second. But then that also levies requirements on your use of subsystems and things like that, right? The reason maneuver is so important is we'll just talk almost sort of exclusively from a DoD perspective. If I need to have an effect in the battle space, I need to be able to get from point A to point B, like just at a very fundamental level, right?
Yep.
I have the capability that I have where I have it. It's not likely that I have the capability where I need it, right? When a conflict starts. So I need to be able to get there, and I need to have that asset be sort of expendable enough that I don't mind using it, right? So this goes to the sort of the risk calculus of commanders, of operational commanders. If I have a low level of information, right, and the arsenal that I have at my disposal is very inexpensive, then I'm going to be very risk off, right? I'm not going to take risks to develop the situation necessarily. But if I am suffering from a significant amount of resources and I have a ton of information that on the opposite side of the scale, then I'm going to take more risks and I'm going to be able to seize the initiative, which means the outcome, I have a higher probability of the engagement outcome being in my favor, right? Cost per meter per second is just the metric we use to describe sort of the operational utility of systems like the Jackal autonomous orbital vehicle.
I see. So then taking a quick step back, because you did mention like on the hardware side and the hardware build of something like Jackal, it sounds like that there's a bit of kind of integration of off the shelf components, but really the special sauce comes from the software layer, Mosaic, that you guys are building. Can you talk a little bit about autonomy for a second? Like, how autonomous is autonomous? Like, where does AI fit into the tech stack? And then I would love to get a little bit of like the data side of what you're collecting, the data that you're collecting. How do you plan to handle a lot of that data? Obviously, it seems like, I assume it'll be a significant amount of data that you're collecting once you're operational, and sort of the data infrastructure that you have in place to kind of handle that. Yeah.
So on the autonomy side, these are open areas of research. So what we are trying to find is the right level of autonomy. If we knew everything about the way that we would want to operate in the space domain, we might be able to drive towards a high level of autonomy right off the bat. But there are just open questions about what decisions we want computers to make in conflict. And because we have less experience in space operations in combat, frankly, than we do in other domains, human intervention becomes more important because you don't want sort of your autonomy to make things worse, right? You don't want to create a negative feedback loop. So this is an area that we will explore on orbit. The way that we're initially exploring that is using artificial intelligence to conduct most of the maneuver planning and some machine vision work. That maneuver planning is presented to a human operator, and then the human operator uploads a set of states to the vehicle. That calculation is not necessarily happening on board, although we do have the computational capacity to go do that. We're really focused on crawl, walk, run. Right? We need to know what the right level, what are the things we can reliably say that autonomy should be used for, and then we'll build from there. There's a lot of really interesting applications, certainly, but for us, it's mostly focused on maneuver. From a data standpoint, the data that we want to collect on orbit is primarily in optical and infrared. So we'll be operating at ranges in proximity to a spacecraft to be able to create resolved imagery. And that's useful for, figuring out what kind of thrusters are on a satellite and what kind of solar panels are on a satellite. And does it have maybe a payload that we didn't know existed, right? Which are really important questions for the military and the intelligence community to be able to answer. As it thinks about what the scale of the threat that's being presented by China and Russia really is today. There's a lot of just unknowns because there isn't like sort of a scaled on-orbit verification capability yet. So we're starting with optical information in the infrared and the visible light spectrums, and we'll add other phenomenologies as we go forward. We'll process that data on board, we'll process that data off board, and then basically create a repository for our own purposes and for customer purposes.
How are you thinking about security and the integrity of the data that you're collecting, right? So that a Jackal isn't getting hacked or attacked itself.
I think there's been a number of senior leaders that have said that like the first salvo is, the first salvo of the next major conflict is in space, but it's coming in the cyber domain, right? So it's an attack against space infrastructure or space assets. I think that's probably true. And certainly one of the risks for True Anomaly as we that we track very carefully and we invest in very heavily is the infrastructure of our spacecraft, the cyber infrastructure of the spacecraft, and the security of that infrastructure, but also our own company's infrastructure. There's been countless cases, too many, of state actors exfiltrating data on designs of really important weapon systems, and we certainly don't want to be a target. One of the risks of having a public presence is that it makes us sort of a more it puts us into the awareness of potential adversaries, which is a major concern for us, and the best way to deal with that is just invest in it, and we do.
Well, I'll tell you, you've done a really good job hiding your capabilities. Because even as I was thinking about this conversation, I was like, obviously furiously Googling as much as I could, and I'm like, man, there's not a lot about these guys out there. So this has been enlightening. But Evan, we got to take a quick break. It's a great conversation, and excited to continue. But Just bear with us a second and we'll be right back after a word from our sponsors. Space is the new frontier for cybersecurity. To quote the commander of the U.S. Space Force's Operations Command, cyber threats are unfortunately the soft underbelly of our global space networks. SpiderOak, the leader in space cybersecurity software, is dedicated to providing space operators with the solutions they need to protect hybrid space systems. Their Orbit Secure software uses a unique combination of end-to-end zero-trust encryption and blockchain distributed ledger, allowing missions to orchestrate and secure Earth-to-orbit, orbit-to-Earth transmission, communication, and storage of sensitive data across even the most complex and unsecure LEO and hybrid space systems. To learn how Orbit Secure can bring zero-trust security and resiliency to your zero-gravity environments, check out SpiderOak at www.spideroak.com. All right, Evan, welcome back. So I wanted to shift gears for a second and talk a little bit at a high level. I know that the DoD loves the term tactically responsive, right? And so much so that they've significantly increased their ask to Congress for a budget to launch satellites, right, more quickly and be able to to prepare for any type of event where an asset in space goes down, to be able to replace it quickly, right? How does True Anomaly fit into this kind of broader plan of tactical and responsive warfare or resiliency?
Thanks, Mo. This actually goes back to what we were talking about previously, which is that metric that we hold, that we track our technical progress against, cost per meter per second. So responsiveness, we as a company, we have sort of optimized for lots of assets that are inexpensive that have a good amount of delta V, right? That's the way that we've solved the problem, because time is another very important variable in conflict. And so our objective is to field a number of systems that allow for access to orbits that are sort of operationally relevant, but also have some reserve capacity to get to orbits that maybe adversaries go to, or that there are anomalies in that that aren't sort of cost effective to have an operator or system pre-existing in those orbits. So the short answer to your question is our solution is to optimize for dollar per meter per second.
Yep.
And to think intelligently about the scales of time on which contingencies occur. So there's sort of three big buckets, right? There's crisis and urgency. There's the thing that you need an immediate response for. The second is sort of what you can't solve in a matter of hours, that requires or is going to evolve into a larger problem that you need a response for on the order of days. And then there's new capabilities that you need to develop rapidly to deal with contingencies that you don't even fully understand, that you couldn't plan for originally. So we have an interesting thesis around this that connects the proliferation of our spacecraft in orbit with a very responsive production capacity, design and production capacity, exactly to meet these needs.
Is the plan over time to vertically integrate the business, or do you see enough components that are just like, it's just not worth our time to be spending any R&D efforts to be building those in-house?
We'll vertically integrate where it makes sense. We're learning as we continue to build and we design new systems. There are certainly things that have to be built in-house because there just isn't a solution on the market today, or the component providers that we've partnered with, it's too capitally intensive for them to go increase the production capacity or decrease the timelines or decrease costs substantially. So it's something we keep an eye on and is really a case-by-case approach.
Got it. I want to go back to something we were talking about earlier, which is just on team, right? And especially starting off with four co-founders, the four co-founders that you started with. How do you think about bridging the gap between military strategy and engineering execution as it comes to the team, right? So maybe talk a little about team construction and how early days. How many folks work at True Anomaly now?
approaching 80 today.
Okay. Well, oh, wow. That's great. Congratulations.
Yeah.
So
Thank you. Yeah.
80 people, started off with 4. How did you think about team construction, and where there were maybe gaps in your own kind of skill set that you felt like you guys needed to bridge?
Yeah, thanks. The insight that we had pretty early on in the company's existence was to very clearly articulate where our founding team had expertise and where we don't. What makes us special is the ability to translate, is to be able to observe sort of things that happen in the domain, the record of the threat, the trajectories and trends in the Space Force's solutions to operational problems, the evolution of those operational problems, and then to be able to create our own solutions, right? So that biases itself towards a product organization, which is really the right place for folks like the founding team that we've put together. I would say this is one of the things that, again, really makes True Anomaly special is we are product focused. We're not requirements driven. So Tom and Dan and Kyle's and my core responsibility is to think about the threat, think about the operational need, and create new products, right? There were no requirements. There were no external requirements for the iPhone. It's sort of one of the adages that's commonly used. But in order to realize those product visions, you have to surround yourself with great operators and great finance people and great people experience people and great engineers. The founding team has enough expertise in all of those areas to be able to select for talent and leadership talent in particular. And then we've let those leaders sort of build the teams that are consistent with our culture and our values.
Yeah. So we didn't talk about this, but you did just close a pretty significant Series A financing round. The reason why I was maybe not surprised, but certainly excited to hear that you guys are already 80 people. Is I'm pretty sure didn't you start the company just last year, kind of early last year, if I'm not mistaken?
Yeah, that's right. Our first day of operations was May 2nd of last year.
Yeah, I mean that's incredible. So from there to being on a transporter mission a year later, and getting traction with the government, I think it's been kind of incredible how quickly you guys have moved, and is it a bit of a testament as to why companies like yours need to exist, right, outside and sitting on sort of the commercial landscape with folks with your background, right? So I think it's a very clear testament to why companies like True Anomaly need to exist.
Thank you. I would add, by the way, it's a testament to this thesis that I think is becoming like more and more obvious, that there's a very powerful relationship or very powerful potential outcome when you pair venture capital with a DoD market, right?
Right.
Particularly given the sort of economic headwinds that we're experiencing globally. Like there is a way to accelerate the fielding of critical capability by leveraging private capital markets, and to do that at unprecedented speed, and to really solve the problems that we're facing as a nation. And you couldn't do that without access to capital. You just can't do it in a sort of more traditional sense.
Yeah. So, I didn't want to get into this topic because I wanted to use time with you to talk about some geopolitics. So I'm going to detour for a quick minute, which is because you brought up something really important. It's actually something that I think about and I talk about quite often, which is like the need for industries like venture capital. And of course, now that there's more openness, right, to fund any type of technology related to defense and dual use technology, right? I mean, I remember even a couple of years ago, there was a allergic reaction to those types of businesses, right? So I'm curious, like, what do you think in the industry has changed culturally that, if you look at any chart on VC defense, aerospace and defense related capital investment, it's just kind of up and to the right. So what do you think from your perspective? Because I think you have a very unique perspective. What do you think changed?
I actually don't have a really strong grasp of sort of how venture capital markets have evolved over the last, N decades. I sort of just plopped into it right. In early last year. So I don't want to get out over my skis with too many sort of like hypotheticals or conclusions, but I'll say just a couple of things that I think I've heard right around the as I've been fundraising, there's a much stronger understanding of the dynamic and the return on investment associated with great defense investments. So it's very clear that defense investing is desirable in certain contexts. I would say probably like universally so, but in certain contexts, particularly the one that I think we all point to today, which is the sort of global macroeconomic headwinds. But the unit economics for defense investing is really good, right? So you have the capacity for high margins. You have almost no counterparty risk, very minimal counterparty risk. It's all sort of front loaded. The Defense Department always pays its bills. And you have a very, very large capacity for leverage, right? So you can invest venture capital. The dynamic here is an investor comes to the table with cash. A relatively small and efficient team proves that there is market traction. You do that with relatively low dollars. And the step function between the sort of first order contract in the single digit millions and the tens of millions is sort of like it's a very fast transition if you deliver, right? So there isn't sort of an incremental uptick. It's these large order of magnitude step functions, which create a sort of synthetic leverage between this back and forth synthetic leverage between the venture capital markets and the Defense Department. And now the Defense Department gets it, right? So they go, okay, well, if I just invest a nominal amount or provide a nominal contract to a small company that's venture backed, I have a higher probability of getting the solution that I need, as long as I have the capacity to show up with cash later, right? So you get this kind of positive feedback loop between venture and the Department of Defense that I think is sort of more obvious today, because companies like Anduril and Shield and others have shown the way, right? For the Space Force's part, I think the message that we're hearing from the government customer is they're so hungry for real solutions that that these investments are more interesting for them to make, right? They're interested in taking these sort of small bets on a broader set of companies, and the ones that are well capitalized and can come to the table with the solution are the ones that are going to win. And that is going to that has historically unlocked access to even more capital, right? Which allows for, again, that's really the underlying dynamic of this.
Evan, that was a great answer.
This back and forth.
You sold yourself short. I bet that was on purpose. No, but that was seriously a great answer.
Got me a little on the fly, but yeah.
No, that's a great answer. And I would actually also add, I think there's also been a realization that companies that focused on the government customer first, as they've built their business, tend to succeed more than the companies that have focused on the commercial customer. There's tons of great businesses with great ideas that focused on a market that just didn't exist yet, and they got themselves into a lot of trouble. So I think there was that realization as well.
I think there was also a realization in the venture markets that there is a right way of selling to the DoD, right? There's now a model for it. Right. There's a way that you have to invest, and there's sort of an order of operations for selling to the Department of Defense. Not every company can do that. So the bias has been sort of dual use technologies, particularly for space. So there have been a lot of venture investing firms whose thesis is, yes, we're interested in defense. And then really this is isolated to space, I think. Yes, we're interested in defense, but we want you to go after a commercial market first and then show that you have the ability to access DoD markets. That's actually not, even though there is some narrative around this from the DoD, that's actually not what the DoD really wants to hear. That's a little bit of a hangover from a couple of historical examples, Iridium being one, where the DoD became super reliant on one provider. Mm-hmm. And that provider became singularly reliant. That commercial operator became singularly reliant on the DoD. So when the commercial operator failed, all of a sudden the warfighter is left holding the bag, right? That risk has subsided a lot. So I think there's just a maturity in the commercial markets and the venture markets understanding of like what good defense sales motion looks like.
Right. No, that's a great point. So we have about 10 minutes left. I'm going to shift gears one more time. And I want to talk to you a bit about deterrence theory, right? And really the idea that, you know, in its simplistic way, right, threatening an adversary with punishment or retaliation, right, that can prevent them from taking a specific action, right. And of course, the obvious example that I think most folks like myself with no background in this understand is like nuclear, right, and thinking about it from a nuclear context. I have nuclear weapons, so you're not going to attack me with a nuclear weapon. How do you think about deterrence in space? Like, what is that going to look like? Do you have any thoughts, ideas? Is that going to be something that is going to be part of military strategy over the next decade or so, as it relates specifically to space?
Yeah. I think the DoD is really starting to articulate a theory of deterrence that includes the space domain. And that began with the sort of confirmation that the vulnerability that has existed in the space domain, stemming from the fact that we're using systems that are not designed to like really defend themselves, and that our adversaries have developed counter space technologies to counter the advantage given by the space domain, or technologies in the space domain. That is the first step, certainly. Now the Space Force and I would say the Department of Defense more broadly has also realized that one of the mandates for the Space Force is to provide independent options in the space domain. So if I can not only defend myself and shore up a vulnerability and not have a vulnerability in a domain, or reduce the quantity and intensity of vulnerabilities in a singular domain, but then have the capacity to hold assets at risk, to disrupt the will and the sensing infrastructure and the communications infrastructure. And these are sort of all typical sort of military tactics, right? So I'm not pointing to anything in particular here, but if you can create uncertainty and dilemmas in one domain that propagate through other domains, particularly in a domain in which there isn't a direct loss of life, or the potential for a direct loss of life, that it becomes very appealing, right? So as conflict has become more multi-domain, it's more important that there not be vulnerabilities in any given domain, right? And because of the interconnectivity of those vulnerabilities, the interconnectivity of the domains, that those vulnerabilities not propagate through other domains. But then also then has the inverse effect, which is I can create options, right? If my adversary is also reliant on multi-domain technologies and it has interconnectivity between those domains, that I can create dilemmas in one domain that propagate through their decision-making and communications infrastructure in other domains. So this is the sort of the ultimate victory here, is to not have to fire a shot.
Right.
It's to have an infrastructure that makes it clear that I can absorb strike, right? But also recover and then seize the initiative. That's sort of like at the theoretical perspective. And again, I'm not a deterrence theorist by any stretch of the imagination, but I would say like where this intersects with what True Anomaly is building is really at the level of our operational test and training infrastructure, driving towards the readiness of space operators to deliver credible combat capability, and then in space domain awareness. So you will make bad decisions with bad information. You have a higher probability of making bad decisions with bad information. And that all stems from having the sensing infrastructure that's in place to know what your adversaries are doing, what their intent is, what the range of options are, and then what their vulnerabilities are, and capabilities.
So as we think about more startups like yourself playing a much bigger role in the Space Force's strategy, I do have to ask: are there other companies, or is there another company out there, veteran owned and operated, that you're most excited about?
I don't spend a lot of time thinking about this. Yeah, there's a lot of really cool defense startups. Modern Intelligence. Is a great one, led by John Dolan. I think Vannevar is really cool. I mean, I think the sort of the vanguard operators in this space, like Shield, like Anduril, are doing amazing and interesting things. I think there's an ecosystem that's building here that's really, really cool. I think that's probably going to lead to some significant consolidation. But I haven't seen a company to date that has sort of the same thesis and capacity that we do.
Yeah.
But I would love, but if you do, Mo, let me know.
Sure. I do have one last question for you. How did you decide on Denver to place HQ?
Yeah, we actually, the lieutenant governor and governor just announced the establishment of our headquarters here. So this question is fresh for me. There's a lot of talent in Colorado. I mean, there's a reason that Palantir moved to Colorado, right? There's a lot of software talent. There's a lot of hardware talent. There's a ton of aerospace talent in particular in Colorado. The universities, so UCCS, University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, the CU system, CSU, Colorado School of Mines are all top tier engineering schools that have really robust space programs. So I just think there's a ecosystem of knowledge, and there's a sort of circulation of human capital between a ton of companies here that we wanted to tap into. And I think there are some other factors that kind of pushed us towards Colorado away from places like California and others. But at the end of the day, True Anomaly will have a nationwide presence in DC, in Texas, in Colorado, in California, and then eventually globally.
Got it. Well, Evan, thanks so much for being on the show. It was a pleasure. We're going to have to get you back on because there's so much that I wanted to ask you that I didn't get a chance to ask you today. But really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks, Mo. It's been a lot of fun.